Ancient texts described a place where the gods lived and death did not exist. Merchants crossed the Persian Gulf searching for it. For centuries, Dilmun connected some of the ancient world's greatest civilizations, and yet today, much of it remains only in fragments. On the northern coast of modern Bahrain, the ruins of Khalat al-Bahrain rise above the shoreline as layers of stone, collapsed walls, and buried foundations accumulated over thousands of years. Archaeologists believe the site served as the main harbor and administrative center of Dilmun during the Bronze Age, particularly between around 2200 and 1700 BCE, when trade across the Gulf intensified. The settlement became wealthy enough to connect distant societies that may never have met directly. The mound itself contains overlapping periods of occupation, stretching far beyond Dilmun alone. Later cultures built over earlier streets. Fortifications replaced older structures. Entire sections disappeared beneath accumulated debris and sand. What survives today is not a frozen city, but the compressed remains of repeated human activity stacked across centuries. The position of Bahrain made Dilmun impossible to ignore. Mesopotamian cities needed copper from Oman. The Indus Valley traded beads, timber, ivory, and crafted goods across enormous maritime distances. Dilmun stood between them. Sumerian administrative texts mention merchants, shipments, taxes, and foreign cargo passing through the region, while inscriptions from Mesopotamia describe Dilmun not as an isolated kingdom at the edge of the world, but as an active and wealthy intermediary linking multiple societies together. Some texts describe it almost practically, others do not. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Dilmun appears as a sacred place associated with purity and immortality, a distant land touched by divine presence. The contrast is striking. One culture recorded it through shipping accounts and trade agreements. Another transformed it into something closer to memory than geography. Even in antiquity, Dilmun already existed somewhere between reality and interpretation, and yet for a society this connected, its voice feels strangely incomplete. The ruins at Khalat al-Bahrain reveal storage areas, workshops, fortifications, temples, streets, and harbor infrastructure. But the people behind them often appear indirectly, reconstructed through trade records, scattered inscriptions, imported objects, and references written by outsiders. Its rulers remain obscure compared to those of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Much of its language is poorly preserved. Its religious life is only partially understood. The deeper archaeologists excavate, the clearer Dilmun's importance becomes, but not necessarily the people themselves. Then the burial mounds begin to appear. Across Bahrain, tens of thousands of earthen mounds spread across the landscape, forming one of the largest prehistoric cemetery complexes on Earth. Some stand alone. Others cluster together in dense fields stretching toward the horizon. Many date to the Dilmun period. Beneath them are stone chambers, human remains, pottery, jewelry, seals, and traces of ritual activity tied to a society whose population may once have covered large parts of the island. The scale changes everything. Dilmun stops feeling like a distant trade kingdom mentioned in old texts and becomes something far larger, a culture that invested enormous effort into burial, continuity, and remembrance. But names rarely survive inside the graves. Most of the people buried beneath these mounds are anonymous now. Their trade networks altered the Gulf. Their ports linked regions separated by thousands of kilometers. Their merchants carried goods between worlds. Yet much of what remains today are fragments. Ruined foundations, scattered artifacts, distant references, and burial landscapes too vast to ignore. Dilmun once stood at the center of the Bronze Age world, but the society itself remains unevenly preserved, remembered through ruins, graves, and the records of cultures that once looked toward Bahrain from somewhere else. And thousands of kilometers away, another place would disappear so completely beneath later history that even its original purpose became difficult to recognize. For centuries, ships arriving in northern Kyushu carried diplomats, monks, merchants, and foreign envoys from across East Asia. Some came from the Korean peninsula. Others arrived from Tang China carrying official messages, luxury goods, religious texts, and knowledge that moved between kingdoms by sea. Near the coastline of modern Fukuoka, one complex received them all. The Korokan operated between roughly the 7th and 11th centuries CE as an official state guest house and diplomatic center tied to Japan's growing contact with the outside world. Historical records describe the complex, but for centuries its exact location remained uncertain. The structure stood near Hakata Bay, positioned to receive ships arriving from across the sea before travelers continued deeper into Japan. Officials stayed within its compounds. Foreign delegations were received there. Trade passed through its harbor routes. At a time when maritime exchange helped shape politics, religion, and culture across East Asia, Korokan became one of the country's gateways to the wider world. The surviving ruins are modest now. Stone foundations, post holes, fragmented walls, but the objects uncovered there reveal how connected the complex once was. Archaeologists recovered Chinese porcelain, Korean pottery, Persian glass, and blue-glazed ceramics linked to the Islamic world, objects that crossed enormous distances before reaching northern Kyushu. The discoveries transformed Korokan from a place mentioned in old texts into physical proof of an international network stretching far beyond Japan itself. Some of the most revealing discoveries are smaller. Excavations uncovered separate toilet facilities, believed to have been used by foreign visitors and local Japanese officials. Later scientific analysis of preserved parasites revealed differences in diet between the groups who stayed there. Even after centuries underground, traces of daily life remained inside the soil itself. Meals, habits, movement between cultures. Korokan stopped feeling like an official complex and became something unmistakably human, a place where people from distant regions once lived beside one another, however briefly. Then the site began to fade. Historical sources suggest a fire damaged the complex during the 11th century as political systems and trade routes across the region began to change. Korokan gradually lost its importance. Buildings disappeared. New structures rose over older foundations. Centuries passed. Fukuoka Castle was later constructed nearby. Military facilities occupied the area. Urban development expanded across the landscape. Eventually, a baseball stadium covered part of the buried remains. The place itself never truly vanished. It was simply absorbed into later history. For generations, people crossed the ground above Korokan without realizing what still lay beneath it. Only during redevelopment and archaeological excavations in the late 20th century did the buried foundations begin to emerge again. In 1987, discoveries confirmed that the long-debated location of Korokan had finally been found. The diplomatic complex described in historical records had remained underground beneath modern Fukuoka for centuries. Korokan once welcomed travelers arriving from across East Asia. Today, much of it survives beneath layers of stone, concrete, and modern construction, not erased completely, but folded into the structures that replaced it. Far from the coastlines of medieval Japan, another society prepared its dead for a journey measured not in distance, but in eternity. During the 1950s, falling water levels near Lake Sevan in Armenia exposed an ancient cemetery that had remained hidden beneath the landscape for centuries. Archaeologists arriving at the site uncovered stone-lined graves, animal remains, weapons, pottery, jewelry, and something far stranger placed beside the dead. Large wooden wagons with massive wheels, carefully dismantled and sealed inside Bronze Age tombs. The cemetery at Lchashen dates primarily between the 14th and 12th centuries BCE, during the late Bronze Age, and contains more than 500 burials spread across the shoreline and surrounding terrain near Lake Sevan. The region itself sits high within the Armenian highlands, surrounded by mountains and long-distance routes that once connected communities moving through the South Caucasus. Many of the graves belong to high-status individuals placed beside objects reflecting wealth, power, and travel across the highlands. But the wagons transformed the necropolis into something far more unusual. At least 6 wagons were discovered at Lchashen. 4 were covered wagons with enclosed wooden frames, built using sophisticated joinery techniques that included mortise and tenon construction reinforced with bronze fittings. Some of the wheels measured around 160 centimeters in diameter. Individual vehicles contained more than 70 preserved wooden components. Even in fragmentary condition, the craftsmanship remained unmistakable. These were not symbolic miniatures. They were full-sized vehicles built to cross the landscape. The surviving reconstructions reveal how imposing they once appeared. Thick wooden wheels, curved structural beams, covered compartments capable of protecting passengers or cargo from the harsh environment surrounding Lake Sevan. Long before roads, engines, or paved routes, these wagons carried goods, supplies, and likely elite individuals through Bronze Age Armenia. Then they were taken apart and placed into the graves. The arrangement inside the tombs appears deliberate rather than accidental. Wheels were removed, wooden sections separated, components positioned beside the dead before the chambers were sealed beneath earth and stone. Some burials also contained the remains of horses and bulls linked to transport and funerary ritual. The vehicles had reached their final destination. Their meaning changed completely at that point. Outside the graves, they represented status, distance, and the ability to cross the landscape itself. Inside the tombs, that purpose ended. The wagons no longer carried people through the Armenian highlands. Instead, they became part of funerary ritual, transformed into objects tied to death. Remembrance and whatever the living believed waited beyond death. Archaeologists remain cautious about assigning exact meanings to the burials, but the scale of investment is impossible to ignore. Constructing these vehicles required labor, resources, woodworking skill, metal fittings, and animals capable of pulling them through difficult terrain. The decision to place them permanently beside elite individuals suggests that the wagons held significance extending far beyond transportation alone. What survived is equally remarkable. Wood rarely remains intact for thousands of years, especially in Bronze Age contexts where moisture, insects, and changing soil conditions usually destroy organic material completely. At Lchashen, environmental conditions and sealed burials preserved portions of the wagons well enough for archaeologists to reconstruct their design generations after the people who built them disappeared. Objects created for movement endured only because they stopped moving entirely. Today, the reconstructed wagons of Lchashen stand among the oldest surviving examples of wheeled transport recovered from the ancient Caucasus. But the graves surrounding them remain quieter than the vehicles themselves. Most of the people buried there have no surviving names. Their voices disappeared long ago. What remains are fragments of wood, stone chambers, animal bones, bronze fittings, and vehicles carefully sealed into the earth beside the dead. The wagons at Lchashen once crossed the landscape of Bronze Age Armenia, carrying people, goods, and status through the highlands near Lake Sevan. In death, they were dismantled, buried, and transformed into monuments of stillness. What survived was never the journey itself, only the traces left behind after it ended. Deep inside another landscape shaped by preservation, time would refuse to erase the dead at all. In 1993, miners working inside the Chehrābād salt mine in northwestern Iran uncovered a human head buried within the rock. The beard was still visible, hair remained attached to the scalp. One ear still held a gold earring. At first, the discovery seemed isolated, a single body kept intact by unusual underground conditions. Then more remains began to appear deeper inside the tunnels. The Chehrābād mine lies within Zanjan province, where salt extraction continued across multiple historical periods as laborers cut galleries into mineral-rich layers beneath the mountain. Salt carried enormous economic value in the ancient world. It preserved food, supported trade, and moved across regional networks as a resource valuable enough to keep generations of miners returning underground, despite the danger of collapse. The underground workings expanded through narrow chambers, carved into unstable terrain where falling rock and shifting salt could bury people without warning. Over time, archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 6 individuals recovered from inside the tunnels. Some dated to the Achaemenid Empire between the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Others belonged to the Sasanian period nearly 1,000 years later. The discoveries revealed that the underground complex had not claimed lives during a single catastrophe. It remained dangerous across centuries. What survived inside the salt changed the excavation completely. Hair remained intact on several bodies. Leather boots survived beside human bones. Wool textiles, ropes, knives, wooden tools, and fragments of food endured within the mineral-rich environment long after ordinary decay should have erased them entirely. One lower leg still remained inside its leather boot, when discovered beneath collapsed debris. The details feel small at first, then they become difficult to ignore. These were not rulers preserved in royal tombs, they were miners. The dead from Chehrābād carried no monumental inscriptions, military victories, or dynastic records into history. Most vanished almost entirely from the archaeological record, surviving only through tools, damaged bones, or indirect references in the systems they supported. Yet the salt preserved traces of their lives more intimately than the remains of many kings. Scientific analysis later identified parasites and dietary evidence that revealed what some of the miners ate before the collapses occurred. Even ordinary routines endured beneath the mountain. The deeper archaeologists studied the tunnels, the stranger the pattern became. Different generations entered the same underground world separated by centuries. Achaemenid workers cut galleries through the mountain. Long afterward, miners under later empires returned to continue extraction inside many of the same dangerous chambers. Collapses happened repeatedly. The dead remained where they fell while political systems changed far above them. Empires shifted. The mine endured. Historical memory rarely preserves laborers with this level of detail. Most disappear almost entirely from history, leaving behind little more than damaged tools or fragments of bone. At Chehrābād, the conditions reversed that pattern. Salt halted decomposition so effectively that ordinary miners remained physically recognizable long after the empires surrounding them fragmented and disappeared. The same material that created the danger also prevented erasure afterward. Inside the tunnels, salt became both the cause of death and the mechanism of preservation. The remains recovered from Chehrābād stand among the most intact ancient mining victims ever discovered. But the underground complex remains quieter than the bodies uncovered inside it. No surviving monument marks where the miners died beneath the mountain. No chronicles recorded their final moments. What endured instead were fragments of hair, boots, tools, clothing, and bodies sealed accidentally within the salt after repeated collapses across centuries of labor underground. Empires rose and disappeared above the Chehrābād mine for generations, but deep inside the tunnels, the workers remained. Elsewhere, another society would preserve memory differently, not by accident, but by deliberately sealing an entire sacred space beneath the earth. Across Peru's northern desert coast stood an ancient temple deliberately sealed by the civilization that built it. Then another structure rose above it. Then another. Over centuries, ceremonial walls, painted friezes, and ritual chambers disappeared inside repeated layers of adobe and earth until entire sections of the complex vanished from sight. Huaca Viejo formed part of the El Brujo archaeological complex near the Pacific coastline of northern Peru, one of the major ceremonial centers associated with the Moche civilization between the 1st and 8th centuries CE. The temple rose within a harsh desert environment, shaped by wind, sand, and seasonal river valleys cutting through the coast. From a distance, the surviving adobe structures appear almost eroded back into the landscape itself. But inside the visible structures, older layers remained sealed for centuries. The site was not constructed in a single phase. Archaeologists identified at least 7 superimposed construction stages, built one above another across generations of Moche activity. Earlier ceremonial structures were intentionally filled with adobe and earth before new temples rose above them. Ritual spaces disappeared beneath carefully placed material rather than collapse or destruction. The sequence repeated again and again. That changes the meaning of burial entirely. The older temples were not abandoned because they no longer mattered. They were enclosed deliberately, transformed into hidden foundations inside newer ceremonial structures. At Huaca Viejo, concealment became part of ritual continuity itself. What survived inside those sealed layers feels almost impossible now. As excavations moved deeper into the structure, archaeologists uncovered vividly painted murals still preserved inside adobe-filled chambers. Warriors carrying weapons, prisoners, ritual processions, mythological figures. Geometric patterns painted in red, yellow, white, and black pigments that should have faded long ago beneath centuries of pressure and desert climate. Instead, many endured because later generations sealed them away from exposure. The murals survived because nobody could see them anymore. That paradox sits at the center of the site. Images originally created for ceremony, authority, and public ritual remained intact precisely because they disappeared from public view. The same act that concealed the earlier temples also protected them from weather, erosion, and time. Burial became preservation. The deeper archaeologists excavated, the more deliberate the pattern appeared. Walls were filled systematically, platforms elevated intentionally. New ceremonial stages incorporated older ritual layers within the structure rather than erasing them completely. The architecture itself became a form of accumulated memory, each generation building physically above what came before while still preserving traces of the older ceremonial world inside. The importance of the site extended far beyond architecture alone. In 2006, excavations revealed the burial of the Lady of Kao, a high-status Moche woman buried with ceremonial objects, weapons, and elaborate tattoos preserved on her body. The discovery challenged older assumptions about political and religious authority within Moche society, suggesting that women may have occupied positions of significant ceremonial power. Yet even her burial remained part of the larger ritual landscape enclosed within Huaca Viejo itself. Around the 7th century CE, environmental instability linked to severe El Niño events may have contributed to the eventual decline and abandonment of the site. Sand accumulated, structures eroded. The visible ceremonial center faded into the desert landscape. But sealed underground, the older layers remained almost exactly where the Moche had left them centuries earlier. At Huaca Viejo, ritual architecture was not simply abandoned when new ceremonial spaces were constructed above it. Older temples were deliberately enclosed inside adobe and earth, transforming burial itself into a form of preservation. The murals survived because they disappeared from sight. Across the Mediterranean, another civilization would leave behind ruins so immense that even destruction itself could not fully erase their presence. Along the southwestern coast of Sicily, enormous Greek temples still lie scattered across the landscape beneath open sky. Columns remain where they fell. Massive stone blocks rest across hillsides covered in grass and wildflowers. In some places, architecture was abandoned so suddenly that quarry workers never returned to complete what they had started. Selinunte was founded during the 7th century BCE by Greek colonists from Megara Hyblea, and eventually grew into one of the largest and most powerful cities in ancient Sicily. Positioned near important maritime routes across the Mediterranean, the city expanded through massive temple complexes, fortifications, sanctuaries, harbors, and residential districts spread across several hills overlooking the sea. At its height, Selinunte may have held tens of thousands of inhabitants. Even now, the scale of the ruins feels disproportionate to the silence surrounding them. Nothing about the city was small. Temple platforms stretched across enormous terraces. Doric columns rose above the coastline. Sanctuaries dominated the surrounding landscape. Some structures ranked among the largest examples of Greek monumental architecture ever constructed outside mainland Greece. Yet the city still feels strangely unfinished. That feeling begins several kilometers away at Cave de Cusa, the quarry that supplied much of the stone used to build Selinunte's temples. The site still contains partially carved column drums, lying exactly where workers abandoned them more than 2,000 years ago. Extraction marks remain visible in the rock face. Some columns were partially separated from the quarry wall, but never transported. Others collapsed beside the cutting areas before construction could begin. The interruption appears sudden enough that entire sections of work were simply left in place. The city seems paused rather than erased. Elsewhere across the ruins, traces of incompletion remain visible. Temple G, one of the largest structures at the site, was never fully finished. Some columns remained unfluted. Construction stopped before the architecture reached its intended form. In 409 BCE, Carthaginian forces attacked Selinunte during a major conflict for control of Sicily. Ancient sources describe widespread destruction and heavy loss of life inside the city walls, but the attack was not the final ending of the site. Parts of Selinunte were later reoccupied. Punic communities reused sections of the settlement. Some structures continued standing for centuries after the political collapse of the Greek city itself. Earthquakes likely toppled several major temples much later, possibly during the medieval period. Stone blocks were removed over generations for reuse elsewhere across Sicily. its collapse unfolded slowly. That gradual unraveling changes the atmosphere of the ruins completely. Selinunte does not feel hidden like buried cities elsewhere in the ancient world. Nothing concealed its temples beneath earth or adobe. The city remained exposed to weather, erosion, earthquakes, and centuries of silence. And yet the monumental scale endured anyway. Collapsed columns still stretch across the ground where they fell. Temple foundations continue to dominate the hills overlooking the Mediterranean coastline. The city no longer functions as a political center, religious sanctuary, or trade hub, but its physical presence remains overwhelming. The architecture outlasted the society that gave it meaning. At Selinunte, history did not erase the city completely. Temples continued standing long after political collapse, while unfinished columns remained abandoned where workers had left them during interrupted construction. The ruins feel less like the remains of a vanished civilization and more like a monumental landscape history simply stopped completing. In another part of the ancient world, memory would survive differently again, not in stone, but in fragments of writing discarded beneath the desert and forgotten for centuries. Outside the ancient Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus, generations of discarded writing accumulated beneath the desert. Letters, tax records, contracts, school exercises, personal complaints, lists of goods bought and sold by people whose names would otherwise have disappeared completely. Most of the texts were never intended to survive at all. The city of Oxyrhynchus flourished for centuries in Middle Egypt during the Ptolemaic, Roman, and Byzantine periods, growing into a major regional center surrounded by canals, agricultural land, administrative districts, temples, churches, and densely populated neighborhoods. Beyond the inhabited areas, rubbish mounds expanded gradually into the dry desert landscape as unwanted documents, broken objects, and discarded material accumulated over generations. Unlike settlements repeatedly flooded by the Nile, the environmental conditions around Oxyrhynchus remained dry enough to preserve enormous quantities of papyrus buried beneath the sand. What endured there would eventually become one of the largest archives of the ancient world. Beginning in the late 19th century, archaeologists Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt excavated huge quantities of papyrus pieces from the ancient dumps surrounding the city. The discoveries quickly expanded beyond expectation. Hundreds of thousands of papyrus pieces emerged from the desert in varying states of preservation. Some remained nearly intact. Others remained as torn scraps carrying only a few visible words. Most were ordinary documents, receipts recording payments, census records, lease agreements, official complaints, court documents, school exercises written by students practicing handwriting centuries ago, inventories listing property, food, animals, and taxes owed to authorities long since vanished from history. Some documents preserve arguments between family members. Others record shipments of grain or disputes over land boundaries. Together, they preserve traces of ordinary lives with a level of detail that monumental inscriptions rarely captured. The voices feel immediate. A student struggling to copy lines correctly, a taxpayer challenging an assessment, someone requesting supplies, someone else writing a private letter that was never meant to survive beyond its original reader. Most of these people held no political power. No temples were raised in their honor. No statues carried their names into history. Yet fragments of their daily lives remained buried beneath the Egyptian desert long after kingdoms and empires surrounding them disappeared. Famous texts emerged from the rubbish as well. Excavations uncovered lost works by Greek playwrights, fragments of poetry, early Christian writings, historical records, and literary texts once believed permanently lost. But even these discoveries remained mixed together with discarded receipts, broken correspondence, and administrative paperwork thrown away by ordinary people centuries earlier. At Oxyrhynchus, literature and garbage survived side by side beneath the same layers of desert sand. Most of the archive remains incomplete. Many papyri survive only as damaged pieces with broken edges and missing lines. Some preserve partial names without context. Others stop in the middle of sentences that can never be fully reconstructed. Scholars continue studying and cataloging material from Oxyrhynchus more than a century after the first excavations began, while enormous quantities of material still remain untranslated, unidentified, or physically joined only in pieces. History survived there in fragments, not through monuments or rulers, but through discarded traces of ordinary lives buried beneath the desert for centuries. Receipts, letters, complaints, broken sentences written by people who never expected anyone beyond their own world to read them again. Long after cities declined and empires faded, their voices remained. Across deserts, mountains, coastlines, and buried cities, pieces of the ancient world survived in ways nobody intended. Trade kingdoms vanished while their graves remained. Diplomatic centers disappeared beneath later history. Wagons built to move were sealed into tombs. Workers lost underground endured longer than the empires above them. Sacred temples survived because they were hidden. Monumental cities stood unfinished beneath open sky, and in the Egyptian desert, even discarded fragments of ordinary lives outlasted civilizations themselves. History rarely preserves what people believed mattered most. Sometimes it leaves behind ruins, sometimes names, sometimes only fragments, and sometimes those fragments are enough to remind us that entire worlds once existed here, even after almost everything else has disappeared. If one of these stories stayed with you, let it travel. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't. The search continues here on Riddle Me This Mysteries.